Jean Rollin Fascination could be classified as a vampire film or a period costume gothic drama. It's less adventurous and it has less avant-garde elements than earlier Jean Rollin films, but it's still very odd and has some elements which a casual viewer might find very foreign or confusing. Fascination came out in 1979. It's a film destined for the exploitation genre cinema market, and it's an odd one in that time, because if you think that's the year movies like Cannibal Holocaust, Beyond the Darkness, Zombie came out. Those are very hard-hitting films with emphasis on explicit, graphic, gory, practical effects. And there comes Fascination, which is this low-key, dreamy film with a little bit of bloodletting, but very little actual gore. And also, at this point in his career, Jean Rollin was just coming off his probably biggest and best known movie, which is Grapes of Death, which is this probably France's first gore movie. And it's mainly set in the great outdoors, with the characters always moving from one location to the other, pursued by these contaminated semi-zombie characters. And then the next year, Jean Rollin comes up with this tale mainly set within one location, the Chateau des Castles. So it's a great change of pace for Rollin. In terms of cast, Fascination doesn't have any particularly well-known actors in it. Probably the biggest name is Brigitte Lahaie, who was also in Grapes of Death. As you know, Jean Rollin is often lumped together with Jess Franco and Joe D'Amato, because they were active around the same time in the European genre cinema market. They have these three filmmakers, they do have some things in common. For example, each of them has contributed at least one Emmanuelle film, unofficial sequels to Emmanuelle movies, and all of them dabbled in the zombie genre. But this is where similarities probably end. I would say Jean Rollin was, in terms of budgets, the least advantaged one, because he never could afford bigger stars. Like Jess Franco and Joe D'Amato both could occasionally hire bigger names, internationally acclaimed actors. They both, for example, had worked with Jack Palance, Klaus Kinski, relatively big names like that, whereas Jean Rollin had to create his own stars, and he, for example, helped Brigitte Lahaie transition from adult movies to genre movies and out of the adult movie ghetto. So he created her as the mainstream actress, and she has an important, prominent part, probably one of her more iconic parts in Fascination. The plot of Fascination is thin and quite simple. We follow this highway robber. It's turn of the century France. It's the early 1900s, and this robber is being chased by his buddies because he'd ripped them off. He took off with this bag full of gold coins, and he ends up fleeing through the forest, and there is a little shootout, and he takes refuge in this creepy looking castle, which stands in the middle of a pond in this forest. And this is the film's main location. And when this robber first runs up towards the castle, it's a very brooding, strong scene. It takes him forever to cross the bridge and enter the castle, and during this time also Philippe Darram's score really helps to channel this eeriness. You can tell straight away that something awful is going to happen within the castle, and the character is unaware that he's heading straight into a trap. And inside the castle, he takes hostages. He finds these two chambermaids, very good looking, very strange, mysterious young girls who seem to put up no resistance. They pretty much put their hands up and say, do whatever you want to us, which already is odd from the outset. And he decides to spend the night in the castle, and little by little the tables are turned on him and he loses his dominant position in the story. And this is the basic plot outline of Fascination. It's very little to go on, but Jean Rollin gets great mileage out of his one location, and with a limited cast he creates this slow-moving, extremely slow-moving but compelling narrative. Fascination looks very low-tech, like most Rollin movies. I think his editing is always quite basic, like there are no elaborate montages. He's not really a filmmaker who likes to dazzle with lots of fancy cuts. He likes long takes, uninterrupted takes, and also there are few, if any, tracking shots in this movie. There is occasionally some handheld camera, but there are no traveling shots, which are generally not that often in Jean Rollin films, unless you think about The Iron Rose, which is full of tracking shots. So Fascination is it's a very atmospheric film. So Rollin lays on the atmosphere really heavily, and the opening credits has this chambermaids dancing to a phonograph record on the bridge, and you immediately are plunged into this decadent, strange world which offers very little answers. We don't really know that much about what motivates the characters. There are some typical Jean Rollin tropes you can recognize in Fascination. For example, this trope of two innocent-looking girls who by night change into something more of a predatory nature, to something more dangerous. It's a bit of a recurring trope in his films, and even his more recent movies such as The Two Orphan Vampires, which is I think from the 1990s, also touches on that trope. The Two Orphan Vampires was adapted from Rollin's own short novel, or novella if you like. Fascination features this iconic scene where Brigitte Lahaie comes out wearing black cape, and she attacks people with a scythe, and it's on the poster. It's one of these images where I think they helped promote Rollin's cinema, because it's a very emblematic image, even though the scene itself is relatively brief in the film, but it seems to have visually worked very strongly on the viewers. There is one actress in the supporting part in Fascination. Her name is Muriel Montauset, and that's another Jess Franco connection, because she's done at least 2 movies for Franco. She was in The Inconfessable Orgies of Emmanuel, and in another one which is known as Cecilia. So there is that minor Jess Franco connection. Fascination came out during the creative apex of Jean Rollin's career. I think between 1974 to 1980, 1981 was the time when he was able to enjoy halfway adequate budgets to fulfill his dreams and to put his visions up on the screen. So all the movies between Lips of Blood and Night of the Hunted probably are the most successful ones, in my opinion, and Fascination comes right in the middle of that period, 1979. I know that quite a few people consider this a landmark Jean Rollin film, and I can see why, because it bridges his early obsession with the semi-abandoned castles and eerie supernatural creatures, and his later less Baroque films. So it's kind of a connecting tissue, you could say. It's a transition movie in my view, because it's, in a way, it's a farewell to the more outrageously artsy moments of his early black and white films and early vampire films, towards a more reduced and more compact later films which had smaller budgets and had to be shot quicker. Movies which came after Night of the Hunted, when the genre of cinema wasn't as in demand anymore, so Roland had to take longer breaks between his movies. He had to work with smaller budgets. He couldn't shoot in castles as much probably as he wanted anymore. So Fascination comes from his golden period. It's a relatively short movie because it moves quite slowly. The build-up takes forever, so it feels maybe longer than it actually is. I would definitely recommend check it out if you are into vampires and odd gothic films. It's a strong contender for one of the finer European bloody movies. Let's say if you think about movies such as Daughters of Darkness or Lips of Blood from Roland, this one fits in nicely. Or maybe the movie Vampires from José Ramón Larraz. This is the kind of rough bracket where you could put Fascination in, but it's in a class of its own with this odd music. Philippe Darram creates this score which is mainly mellotron, and there is, I think, a touch of theremin and this bit of a tom-tom drum, if I'm not mistaken, and it's used sparingly in the film and builds up this very fine atmosphere of dread without ever going bombastic. Fascination is like no other film in Jean Roland's filmography. Like his early 2 or 3 vampire movies, I could say they're a little bit interchangeable because they reuse the same cast, and I even confuse them sometimes because of the titles, because there is always a vampire in the title, so I do not navigate them as well as the ones that came out between the mid-70s to early 80s, where he started to really make very different movies, where it was very easy to tell them apart. So you could never confuse Fascination and Night of the Hunted, or Night of the Hunted and Grapes of Death, or Grapes of Death and Zombie Lake. Those are all very different films, which something I like. Or Living Dead Girl is a very different movie, even though technically it could be classed as a zombie film, but again it's in a genre of its own. So Fascination is a great it's really a decent way. If you're new to Jean Roland, this could be a very good way to check out his films, where you see some of the more difficult aspects, such as very slow pacing, minimum of characterization and plot, and heavy reliance on somewhat cliched tropes, you know, gothic castles, billowing curtains. But at the same time, there is a subversiveness to Roland's film, which you do not see in a lot of the Italian Gothic films, for example. In this film, you see this male character who starts out in a fairly strong position, in a dominant position, and he stands to win and get what he wants. But somehow, through this fascination which the girls exert upon him, he tends to lose his advantage over time, and he fails to build on his advantage, and this is where the tables are turned on him. And this is the trope which is similar to what we see in Night of the Hunted, where the hero towards the end is he has nearly rescued his beloved girlfriend. He's bust into the enemy tower and he's got a gun, and then for some reason he just succumbs to the evil woman's charms, and they go off dancing for a long period of time. So instead of running and saving his girl, he allows himself to be hypnotized away from his victory, which I found an interesting kind of self-destructive trope some of Jean Roland's male heroes tend to have. Also, it's interesting what happens to the tougher male heroes in Grapes of Death. So the more I watch Jean Roland, the more I rewatch his movies, the more certain tropes become apparent to me. This year is this ancient DVD from Redemption Films. It's a bit of a museum piece by now, but I would strongly recommend check out the Blu-rays. There are at least 2 Blu-ray editions, one in the States, one on the continent. So as far as my top Jean movies go, I would say Fascination is probably number 4 or 5. It's not my favorite one, but I do come back to revisit it, and I do see its merits and acknowledge its importance within the Jean Rollin canon.